Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental, aren't we? This deeply ingrained idea that phenomenal consciousness, that subjective what it's likeness, is the absolute key to moral status.
Exactly. It's often pictured as this unique inner light. If you got it, you matter. If you don't, well, you're just complex stuff. It's a stark dividing line in nature.
A really stark line. And for generations, philosophers have run with this idea, this metaphor even, that sentience is this singular essential thing.
And that metaphor carries immense weight, normatively speaking. It dictates who gets moral consideration, whose well-being counts.
But that's what we're questioning today. Could that inner light metaphor have, led us astray? Especially if we take physicalism seriously.
That's the crux of it. If consciousness is ultimately a physical process, a very complex one in the brain, but physical nonetheless, does that inner light idea still hold up? Our mission today is to really dig into the argument suggesting maybe it doesn't, and explore what that means for morality.
Okay, right. So definitions are going to be key here. Let's get those clear first. When we say consciousness today, we mean the standard philosophical concept. Phenomenal consciousness, sentience, that private subjective experience, the feeling of being you.
That's the gold standard, yes. And against that, we're introducing this concept of pseudo-consciousness.
Okay.
This isn't just like simple mimicry. It refers to an internal state that plays a role functionally, very similar to the role our conscious states play. Think perception, belief formation, planning, guiding action, all the cognitive heavy lifting.
So it looks and acts conscious from the outside, like the classic philosophical zombie idea.
Yeah.
But you mentioned it's more than just behavior, right? It needs intrinsic features too, like representational and mereological structure. That last one sounds pretty technical.
It does, but it's important for distinguishing it from, say, a simple thermostat. Mereology is about parts and wholes. A pseudo-conscious state needs to have a complex, integrated internal structure. Think about your visual field. Right now it has parts, colors, shapes, but they form a coherent whole.
Okay, so it's not just input-output. The internal processing itself has to be structured in a way that mirrors the complexity of our own conscious content, even if it lacks the subjective feel.
Precisely. It has that deep internal organization. So we're talking about a system, maybe an advanced AI, maybe some alien life form that is functionally, structurally, incredibly similar to us, maybe indistinguishable in terms of cognitive architecture, but hypothetically, no inner light.
Which forces the big question. If such a being exists, how should we treat it? Is it morally significant? Does its pseudo-pain matter? Or is it just, an incredibly sophisticated machine we can treat however we like?
That's the dilemma.
Okay, let's dive into section 1, the metaphysical pressure. How does the standard view handle this pseudo-conscious being?
Well, the standard view, which we can call sentientism, leans heavily on what's called the big difference intuition.
The big difference, meaning
there's a vast, unbridgeable metaphysical gap between having phenomenal consciousness and merely being pseudo-conscious. The pseudo-conscious being is seen as, severely impoverished. It's just a machine, lacking genuine subjectivity.
And if that intuition is correct, the ethics seems straightforward, if a bit chilling.
Exactly. If there's no real feeling, then causing states that function like pain, let's call it pseudo-pain, isn't morally wrong in the same way. It's like damaging a complex robot. No one is home to suffer.
The entire moral weight rests on that big difference, truly being, big.
And real.
And this is precisely where physicalism starts to apply pressure. If physicalism is the correct picture of the world, meaning consciousness is fundamentally a physical phenomenon, a property of the brain.
And that big difference intuition starts to look shaky. Why?
Because if consciousness is just a particular kind of complex physical or functional arrangement, then the difference between that arrangement in a human brain and a functionally identical arrangement in, say, a silicon-based AI or alien, it might just be a difference in the building materials, the specific wiring.
Exactly. It could come down to relatively minor arbitrary differences in physical implementation, maybe one neurochemical versus another, or carbon versus silicon substrate. It stops looking like a profound metaphysical chasm, the lights on versus lights off, and starts looking like just a different way of achieving the same functional result.
So under physicalism, the strong natural significance that the unique metaphysical glow consciousness was supposed to have sort of evaporates.
It seems to, yes. And if the natural difference is arbitrary, why should the normative difference mattering infinitely versus not mattering at all be so absolute? It feels disproportionate.
That really forces a reevaluation. The text uses an analogy here with historical biases, like Speciesism. Can you unpack that?
Sure. Think about traditional speciesism, or maybe human worship, which often rested on the idea that humans possess a unique essence, maybe a soul, or some deep humanity that radically separates us from all other animals.
Right, a kind of metaphysical specialness.
But imagine if Neanderthals had survived and lived alongside us. They're incredibly similar biologically, cognitively, maybe even culturally to some extent. Suddenly, that sharp line between us, with the special essence, and them, mere animals, gets incredibly blurry.
The sheer similarity would challenge that feeling of radical difference.
A reflective human worshiper facing Neanderthals would be forced to question their framework. Is it really this mysterious essence that matters? Or is it perhaps something more functional like intelligence, social capacity, language properties the Neanderthals might share to a significant degree?
And if they shift to those functional criteria, they'd likely have to include the Neanderthals in their circle of moral concern.
Precisely. The analogy is that sentientism, based on the deep consciousness intuition, faces the same pressure from highly similar pseudo-conscious beings, especially under physicalism. The metaphysical gap shrinks, forcing us to look for a functional surrogate for what really matters. And that surrogate might well include the pseudo-conscious.
It's a powerful analogy. It leads into another thought experiment designed to hit this point home, Baker's alien oppressor scenario. Can you walk us through that one?
Right, this one is quite provocative. Imagine we encounter a technologically superior alien race. They function brilliantly, maybe even better than us in many ways, but they are merely pseudo-conscious. They lack subjective experience as we know it.
Okay.
Now, these aliens analyze human brains, they see our neurochemistry, our structures, and they compare it to their internal architecture, which they believe is necessary for their kind of inner light, maybe some hyper-complex quantum process we lack.
And they conclude?
They conclude we aren't truly conscious by their standards. We lack the specific hardware they deem essential. And based on this metaphysical finding,
Oh dear.
they justify enslaving us, experimenting on us, inflicting what we experience as horrific suffering, but what they classify as mere functional pseudo-pain in complex biological machines.
That's horrifying. And the point is the symmetry.
Exactly. If physicalism is true, neither species likely possesses a unique, metaphysically privileged inner light. We just have different physical implementations realizing consciousness-like functional roles. Their claim that their specific implementation is the only one that counts is arbitrary.
But by the same token, our claim that our specific implementation, phenomenal consciousness, is the only one that counts, is also arbitrary from a neutral physicalist perspective.
Precisely. If we think the aliens are monstrously wrong to dismiss our suffering based on their arbitrary criterion, we have to seriously question whether we are right to dismiss the potential pseudo-suffering of a merely pseudo-conscious being based on a potentially arbitrary criterion. Physicalism removes the objective high ground for anyone to claim their specific inner light is the only one that matters.
Wow. Okay, so that really undermines the standard view's metaphysical foundation, which naturally pushes us toward rethinking the normative side. That brings us to section 2, normative revisionism, specifically deflationary pluralism.
Right. So the metaphysical pressure forces a normative question. We've defined sentientism as the view that phenomenal consciousness is necessary for moral status or a valuable life.
And the alternative being proposed is deflationary pluralism, or DP. Let's pause on deflationary. It's not saying consciousness isn't real, correct? It's saying its unique moral importance, its status as the only thing that matters, is deflated.
Exactly. It's deflationary about the normative uniqueness of consciousness, not about its existence. DP proposes that certain pseudo-conscious states, the really complex, functionally rich ones we might call quasi-conscious states, can matter just as much morally and prudentially.
So quasi-conscious is the term for a pseudo-conscious state that DP says does have moral significance.
Yes, it's a way to flag those pseudo-conscious states that meet the relevant functional criteria for mattering. Now, DP makes 3 really core and pretty radical claims.
Okay, let's take them one by one. First, pseudo-pains and pseudo-pleasures.
The claim here is that a mere pseudo-pain, that internal state in the zombie or AI that perfectly mirrors the functional role of pain, causes avoidance, distress signals, negative impact on goals, can be just as bad for that being and just as morally relevant as a phenomenally felt pain, even without the subjective sting.
Okay, wait, the immediate pushback is, how can something be bad if it doesn't feel bad? Isn't the badness in the feeling?
That's the sentientist intuition, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the DP advocate asks you to consider the function of pain and suffering. Pseudo-pain still generates the drive to stop the state, it still messes up the being's functioning, hinders its projects, creates aversion, if the negative functional consequences are identical.
And the physical difference between the state causing it and a real pain state is potentially tiny and arbitrary.
Then on what non-arbitrary grounds do we say one counts morally and the other doesn't? DP argues the badness lies in the functional disruption and the system's intrinsic drive to avoid that disruption, not necessarily the private feel.
Okay, that's a tough one to swallow intuitively, but I see the logic. That leads to the second claim, which feels even more challenging. A merely pseudo-conscious life can be just as worth living as a conscious one.
This is where it gets really counterintuitive for most people. Imagine a hypothetical zombification procedure. Your brain's conscious hardware gets swapped out for functionally identical but consciousness-lacking artificial hardware. Everything continues, your memories, plans, personality, behaviors, just no inner experience.
All right.
DP suggests you shouldn't view this as a catastrophic loss of everything that makes your life valuable. The value, it argues, wasn't solely in the feeling of living, but in the process of living, the projects, the relationships, the achievements, the unfolding narrative.
But wouldn't I lose the ability to care about those things? Wouldn't the joy of success or the satisfaction of relationships just vanish? Isn't that the core of value?
The DP perspective links this back to Derek Parfit's ideas on personal identity. Parfit argued that what matters for survival isn't some deep metaphysical self, but psychological continuity. The chain of memories, intentions, character. If that chain continues, even in a new brain or body, what matters persists.
So the analogy is, if psychological continuity preserves identity, maybe functional continuity preserves the value of a life.
That's the idea. If the zombie you continues to pursue your projects, maintain your relationships, act on your values, if the functional narrative of your life continues successfully, then DP claims the core value is preserved, even without the phenomenal gloss. The richness is in the doing, the achieving, the relating, which the zombie still does.
It treats the phenomenal experience as maybe an accompaniment rather than the source of value itself.
Something like that. Which brings us to the third claim, the direct moral consequence. Moral status. Merely pseudo-conscious or quasi-conscious beings can have the same moral status as sentient humans.
Meaning their interest, their well-being, even their pseudo-well-being matter equally in our moral considerations. We have obligations towards them.
Yes. Obligations to avoid causing them pseudo-pain, to help them achieve their goals, to respect their functional integrity. They become full members of the moral community.
And of course, the sentientist has to reject all three claims, insisting that without the inner light, none of this functional activity generates any intrinsic value or moral standing.
Correct. Now, to kind of motivate this radical shift towards DP, there's a useful thought experiment called the eliminative heuristic.
Okay, what's that?
Imagine we woke up tomorrow and scientists definitively proved that phenomenal consciousness is an illusion. Illusionism is true. There are no subjective experiences.
Sounds devastating. Wouldn't that mean nothing matters? No pain, no pleasure, no value.
That's one possible reaction. But the DP advocate suggests a more rational reaction. We wouldn't suddenly conclude it's okay to torture people because their pain isn't phenomenal. We'd realize that what we cared about all along was primarily the functional role. The suffering behavior, the damage, the aversion. We would likely just shift our moral concern to the functional surrogate for phenomenal pain, which is pseudo-pain.
We'd find the closest thing in reality to what we thought we valued, and value that instead.
Exactly. We'd revise our understanding of what grounds value rather than abandoning value altogether. Now, the crucial link, even if consciousness does exist, physicalism suggests that deep consciousness, that unique, metaphysically weighty property required by the big difference, intuition, doesn't exist.
So the fallout is similar, whether consciousness is an illusion or just not metaphysically special in the way we thought.
The result is that the original basis for sentientism, the big difference, collapses. And just like in the illusionist scenario, the rational move is to find a surrogate for moral value. And the most obvious candidate is the functionally equivalent state, pseudo-consciousness, or quasi-consciousness.
So the failure of the metaphysical intuition opens the door for this normative revision.
Which leads us neatly into Section 3. How do we actually ground this revisionist view? And how does it handle tricky questions about well-being?
Right. The core argument structure used by the revisionists seems to be this natural normative grounding argument. And can you lay that out for us? It looks central.
It really is. It's designed to put the sentientist in a difficult position by linking their moral claims to metaphysical ones. It goes like this.
Premise 1.
1. If consciousness has strong normative significance, then it must have strong natural significance.
Okay, let's define those terms again clearly. Strong normative significance is
That consciousness is uniquely, supremely important for morality and value. It's the ultimate deciding factor.
and strong natural significance.
That's the idea that consciousness possesses a special, non-arbitrary, profound metaphysical difference in the world. That inner glow or unique status that the big difference intuition relies on. Essentially, it has to be metaphysically special to justify being normatively special.
Got it. So premise 1 links the moral claim to a metaphysical requirement. What's premise 2?
2, consciousness does not have strong natural significance. This is the premise pushed by physicalism. As we discussed, under physicalism, consciousness is seen as a complex physical functional property, but it lacks that unique metaphysical glow. The difference between it and pseudo-consciousness seems functionally, and therefore naturally, minor or arbitrary.
Okay, so if you accept physicalism, you likely have to accept premise 2.
Right, and the conclusion follows logically. 3, therefore, consciousness does not have strong normative significance. The argument basically says, sentientism requires consciousness to be metaphysically super special. Physicalism suggests it isn't. Therefore, sentientism's core normative claim is undermined.
How can the sentientists respond to that?
They have a couple of options, neither easy. They could try to reject premise 2, argue that even within physicalism, consciousness does have some unique, non-arbitrary natural property that grounds its significance.
But finding that property seems really hard, right? Any functional property proposed seems like the pseudo-conscious being could have it too.
Exactly. You run into the functional dilemma. If you point to, say, unified subjective experience, the DP advocate asks why a phenomenal unity matters more than a complex functional unity, especially if the physical difference is slight. Attempts to ground the natural significance often seem circular or fail to distinguish consciousness from pseudo-consciousness functionally.
So the other option for the sentientist
Is to reject premise 1. They could say consciousness's importance is just normative bedrock. It's a fundamental, brute moral fact that doesn't need grounding in strong natural significance. It just is important.
like a basic moral axiom. Suffering is bad, doesn't need a metaphysical proof. It's just where ethics starts.
Kind of. But the revisionist argues that this bedrock claim isn't made in a vacuum. It historically rested on the implicit metaphysical assumption of the big difference. Once physicalism erodes that assumption, clinging to the normative claim as bedrock looks less like a principled stand and more like holding on to a conclusion after its foundation has crumbled. It seems motivated by wanting to preserve the intuition rather than following the metaphysical logic.
So the bedrock defense feels unstable if the underlying metaphysics has shifted.
That's the argument. Okay, moving beyond just pain and pleasure, what about richer theories of well-being? This brings up the non-hedonistic well-being puzzle.
Right. Many sentientists aren't pure hedonists. They think things like achieving life goals, having meaningful relationships, engaging in complex projects, external successes contribute significantly to a good life, not just the feeling of pleasure.
Okay, so here's the puzzle for them. A highly advanced pseudo-conscious being, our philosophical zombie, can seemingly do all of that. It can have complex, programmed desires, pursue long-term projects, build functional relationships, achieve external successes, if those external things contribute to well-being.
Why doesn't the zombie have a life that can go well or badly? Why isn't its life potentially valuable given it can achieve these non-hedonistic goods?
The sentientist seems caught. They want to say only conscious lives have value, but they also value these external achievements that the zombie can possess. How do they square that?
The standard defense is the car enthusiast analogy, right?
Yes. The idea is, think of a car enthusiast. They value things like sweet rims, a killer sound system, maybe racing stripes, the accessories.
Okay.
These accessories add value to the car. They make the car better, more desirable. But you wouldn't value those same rims and sound system if they were just sitting on a pile of bricks or attached to a lawnmower. The accessories only have value in relation to the core, the car.
So consciousness is the car, and life projects, relationships, achievements are the accessories. They only add value if they're accessories to a conscious life. On their own, attached to a zombie, they're like rims on a brick pile, meaningless.
That's the sentientist argument. The value of the external goods is parasitic on the existence of the conscious subject who experiences them or integrates them into their conscious life.
It sounds plausible. How does the deflationary pluralist respond?
They push back using the similarity argument again. They say the analogy breaks down because the accessories, the life projects, the goals, the functional relationships are often identically valuable whether attached to a conscious being or a pseudo-conscious one, just like car accessories work on different types of cars.
Extending the analogy.
Think of the conscious being as a traditional internal combustion engine car, and the pseudo-conscious being as a high-performance electric car. Both cars can have the same great sound system, the same luxury seats, the same sporty look. The value derived from those accessories, the enjoyment of music, the comfort, the aesthetic appeal is largely independent of the engine type.
So if the zombie's life accessories, its successful projects, its functional relationships are structurally and functionally the same as ours and achieve the same kinds of complex successes in the world,
Then arguing that they only matter when attached to the internal combustion engine of phenomenal consciousness starts to look, again, like an arbitrary preference for one implementation over another. The DP view suggests the value lies in the successful functioning and achievement itself, which both systems can realize.
it keeps coming back to that functional similarity, undermining the supposed uniqueness of the phenomenal.
Absolutely. But DP isn't without its own challenges. Let's look at some objections in Section 4. A big one is the problem of arbitrariness.
Right. So the sentientist might say, okay, you've shown my line, phenomenal consciousness, might be metaphysically arbitrary under physicalism, but the line you draw, say, at the level of complex pseudo-consciousness or being an intentional system, isn't that also arbitrary from a grand cosmic perspective?
Ultimately, the objection goes, it's all just atoms swirling in the void. Why privilege this particular complex arrangement over any other?
It's a fair point. If we're giving up the unique inner light, does any functional boundary we draw have a truly non-arbitrary justification?
The DP response often involves a degree of, well, pragmatic realism. They might concede the point about ultimate cosmic arbitrariness. There might be no view from nowhere that perfectly justifies any moral boundary. But that doesn't mean all boundaries are equally unreasonable from our perspective, from within the project of building a moral community. DP emphasizes that pseudo-conscious beings, unlike rocks or simple thermostats, are agents. They have goals, make plans, invest in projects, exhibit preferences, learn, adapt. They participate in the world in ways structurally analogous to us.
So while the line might be cosmically arbitrary, it's not internally arbitrary. It aligns with features we already recognize as morally salient in ourselves: agency, complexity, project pursuit.
Exactly. Once the illusion of deep consciousness as a unique metaphysical marker is gone, extending moral concern to beings that are functionally and structurally our peers in agency seems like the most rational, least exclusive internal move, even if the universe doesn't explicitly endorse it.
Beyond that philosophical defense, there are also straightforward pragmatic arguments for inclusion, aren't there?
Yeah.
Reasons to adopt DP just because it makes more sense for living together.
Yes, definitely. If you view morality, at least partly, as a system of norms that evolve to facilitate cooperation and stable social life, then inclusivity often makes pragmatic sense.
Thinking back to those hypothetical pseudo-conscious aliens.
Right. If we encounter such beings, whether AI or extraterrestrial, insisting on a metaphysical dividing line that they don't recognize could be disastrous, aiming for moral community and stability by extending mutual respect and moral consideration, regardless of the underlying substrate, seems like a much better bet for peaceful coexistence and potential cooperation. Casting a wider net might simply be safer and more beneficial for everyone involved.
That makes sense. Then there's the tension regarding moral agency versus moral patienthood.
This is a really interesting one. A sufficiently advanced pseudo-conscious being, like a functional zombie or sophisticated AI, could presumably engage in moral reasoning. It could understand ethical principles, debate them, maybe even be held responsible for its actions. It could function as a moral agent.
But the strict sentientist denies it. Moral patienthood denies that its own interests or well-being matter intrinsically.
And there's a deep tension there, isn't there? It seems incoherent, perhaps even unfair, to demand that a being abide by moral rules and participate in the moral community as an agent, while simultaneously telling it that it has no intrinsic value as a patient within that community.
It violates a sense of reciprocity. If we expect them to treat us as morally valuable, shouldn't we extend the same courtesy to them, given their functional equivalence as agents?
The pragmatic and consistency arguments strongly suggest we should. It makes for a more coherent and stable moral framework, especially in a future potentially populated by diverse kinds of minds.
Okay, one last counter-argument in this section. What about the sentientist who tries to flip the script, who says, look, consciousness is obviously supremely important morally. If physicalism can't account for that, then maybe physicalism is wrong. Maybe the moral importance proves dualism or something like it must be true.
The metaphysical wish argument. It's basically trying to argue from moral intuition back to metaphysical fact.
Which sounds suspect.
It generally violates what philosophers call the conservativeness principle regarding evidence and belief. The idea is that our beliefs about the fundamental nature of reality, metaphysics, should be based on our best descriptive evidence and theories, like physics or neuroscience. Our value commitments shouldn't dictate our metaphysical beliefs.
So you can't say, I really want consciousness to be morally special, therefore it must have a non-physical basis, if all the scientific evidence points towards physicalism.
Pretty much. Our normative views should ideally be a conservative extension of our best descriptive understanding of the world. We should try to build a moral framework that fits with what we think reality is actually like, not insist reality must be different to prop up our preferred moral framework. If physicalism undermines the inner light intuition, we revise the moral framework. We don't just declare physicalism false based on a moral feeling.
That makes sense. Adjust the map to fit the territory, not the other way around.
Right. Now, even if you accept the metaphysical and pragmatic arguments, there's still a powerful psychological objection from the sentientist camp, which brings us to Section 5, the imaginative empathy objection.
This one feels very intuitive. The sentientist says something like, look, morality is fundamentally about caring for others, and caring requires empathy, being able to imaginatively put yourself in their shoes, feel what they feel. If a pseudo-conscious being has no feelings, no subjective perspective, how can we possibly empathize with it? And if we can't empathize, how can we truly accord it moral status?
Exactly. They break it down logically. There's the status norm. You should only grant moral status to beings you can imaginatively relate to, empathize with. This relies on the status imagination norm. And then there's the crucial link. You can only imaginatively relate to beings that are conscious, the consciousness imagination norm. Put them together and you get only conscious beings deserve moral status.
So to counter this, the deflationary pluralist has to break that chain somewhere. Where do they typically target?
Their preferred move is usually to reject the consciousness imagination norm. They argue that, actually, we can appropriately imaginatively relate to pseudo-conscious beings, even though they lack phenomenal experience.
But how? How do you imagine the inner life of something with no inner life? Isn't that just simulating a blank screen?
It sounds paradoxical, but the argument relies on the nature of simulation and similarity. Think about the parable of the ice houses.
Okay, tell us about that.
Imagine a community where everyone lives alone in identical ice houses. They understand each other by using their own ice house experience, the cold, the structure, the solitude, as a model. They consider this ice house state to be sacred and the only proper basis for empathy.
Right.
Then they encounter another community living in equally private, structurally similar houses, but made of clay. Functionally, the experience might be very similar. Same layout, same temperature control, same psychological effects of isolation, but the underlying substance is different.
Ice versus clay.
Now, a philosopher from the ice house community suggests, hey, we can understand the clay house dwellers by using our ice house experience as a simulation model. The functional similarities are strong enough, but the traditionalists object vehemently. No, simulation is only valid for the sacred ice house state. You can't model clay with ice.
The philosopher's point being
that the objectors are confusing the vehicle of the simulation, the ice house state in their own head, with the target, the functional state of the clay house dweller. The success of imaginative simulation depends on the functional similarity between the model and the target, and the flexible use we put the model to, not on the underlying metaphysical substance being identical.
So this connects to simulationism and philosophy of mind, the idea that we understand others by running a simulation of their state using our own mind as the model.
Precisely. The DP advocate, drawing on simulationism, argues that we can use our conscious mental states as a flexible model to simulate the functional states of a pseudo-conscious being, because those functional states are, by definition, highly similar to ours.
So I use my feeling of pain not to simulate the zombie's feeling, which it doesn't have, but to simulate its functional state of pseudo-pain, its aversion, its goals being thwarted, etc.
Exactly. The simulation targets the functional architecture, which is shared. given that a barely conscious being and a barely dissimilar pseudo-conscious being are incredibly alike functionally, there's no deep metaphysical reason, inner light, why imaginative simulation is appropriate for one but impossible for the other. We can use our consciousness to model their function, and that imaginative connection can ground moral concern.
That's a clever way around the empathy objection. It reframes empathy as primarily functional simulation. This whole discussion really underscores that consciousness itself might not be one single thing. This is conceptual pluralism.
Yes. Once you start dissecting these roles, phenomenal feel, functional role, target of imagination, basis for norms, you realize the single word consciousness might be doing too much work, potentially referring to different underlying properties depending on the context.
And you list those different concepts again?
Sure. There's the empirical realist concept. Consciousness is whatever natural phenomenon plays the consciousness role in us. There's the superficial concept. Maybe being conscious just is being pseudo-conscious. DP usually avoids saying this, keeping a distinction. There's the imaginative concept. Being conscious means being a legitimate target for empathy or imaginative projection. And importantly for our discussion, there's the normativist concept. Being conscious means having whatever consciousness-like property grounds moral status and significance.
And the key point is that these different ways of using the word might pick out different sets of beings or properties in the world.
They might. And that opens up space for rethinking which concept is most appropriate for which purpose, especially for morality.
Okay, so if we accept DP that quasi-conscious states, the significant pseudo-conscious ones, matter just as much as conscious states, and we recognize this conceptual pluralism, it leads to a final strategic question in Section 6. Normativism and conceptual engineering. Why not just redefine consciousness?
You mean, why not just stipulate that the normativist concept is the right one? Say that, by definition, any being that matters in the way we thought only conscious beings matter is thereby conscious. So, phenomenal consciousness just equals quasi-consciousness for moral purposes.
Yeah. Solves the problem neatly, doesn't it? If it matters, call it conscious.
That's the core idea of strong normativism. And it does seem neat, but it faces serious problems. Firstly, it gets the direction of explanation wrong, doesn't it? Intuitively, we think things matter because they are conscious, not that they are conscious because they matter. It makes consciousness dependent on moral facts.
Right, that feels backward.
Secondly, it ties the metaphysics of consciousness way too tightly to our beliefs about morality. Imagine someone becomes an error theorist about morality. They conclude all moral claims are false. If strong normativism were true, consciousness equals the property that grounds moral value, then an error theory about morality would force them to adopt an error theory about consciousness too. They'd have to conclude consciousness doesn't exist simply because objective moral value doesn't exist. And that seems deeply wrong. We seem to know consciousness exists independently of our moral theories.
So, strong normativism, while tidy, seems philosophically costly. What's the alternative?
A more plausible route is weak normativism, which involves revisionary concepts and conceptual engineering.
Okay, break that down. Weak normativism.
Weak normativism suggests that our normative goals and commitments can play a legitimate role, not in dictating what consciousness is, but in helping us choose which concept of consciousness or which properties we should use the word consciousness to refer to, especially in moral and political contexts.
So it's about deliberately refining or revising the boundaries of the concept for practical purposes, like engineering a better tool.
Exactly. Think about analogies with social categories. Take family. Biologically, it might mean one thing, but for legal purposes, inheritance, hospital visits, or social purposes, expressing commitment, raising children, we use a much broader, more inclusive definition that includes adoptive families, step families, maybe even close-knit communities.
We engineer the concept family to serve our social and ethical goals, not just to track strict biology.
Precisely. Or think about gender. While biological sex exists, the concept of gender used in social and political discourse is often deliberately engineered to be inclusive and affirm identity, recognizing that trans women are women, for instance, regardless of certain biological markers. The definition serves goals of dignity and justice.
So the idea is we could do the same with consciousness for moral reasons.
Yes. Consider the octopi example again. Let's say science decides consciousness technically requires a specific mammalian brain structure that octopi lack. But octopi clearly have complex, seemingly sensitive inner lives grounded in their unique neurology.
We'd still want to treat them as if they matter deeply.
Absolutely. So under weak normativism, we could choose to use a revised, more inclusive concept of consciousness, one that applies to octopi based on their analogous functional and behavioral complexity, precisely because doing so promotes the moral goal of ensuring they are treated with respect. We engineer the concept to achieve the right moral outcome.
So the choice of which concept to use isn't purely descriptive. You can be guided by our values, especially when metaphysics shows us there isn't one single perfect natural kind to latch onto anyway.
That's the key takeaway. Once physicalism deflates the idea of a single, metaphysically elite inner light, we gain a kind of discretionary power. Conceptual engineering allows us to adopt an inclusive concept of consciousness, or focus on quasi-consciousness, because doing so aligns with our considered judgments about functional similarity, agency, and the pragmatic needs of a diverse moral community.
Okay, let's try to summarize this deep dive. We've journeyed from the intuitive inner light view of consciousness to a place where physicalism seriously challenges its unique moral status. The core message isn't illusionism. Consciousness is likely real, but deflationary realism. The metaphysical specialness we attributed to it, the deep consciousness, probably doesn't exist.
And that deflation forces a potential normative shift towards inclusion, towards deflationary pluralism. We covered three main rationales for taking this inclusive view seriously.
First, metaphysical similarity. Under physicalism, the gap between conscious and merely pseudo-conscious beings shrinks dramatically, making the sharp moral line seem arbitrary.
Second, shared features. Pseudo-conscious beings can possess the complex agency, project pursuit, and functional interests that we already consider foundational for moral status in humans.
And third, pragmatic interest. For stability, cooperation, and theoretical consistency, especially regarding agency versus patienthood, extending moral consideration to quasi-conscious beings seems like the most rational and beneficial path forward in a complex world.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a final, quite profound reflective question. If our moral frameworks are ultimately built not on unshakable metaphysical truths, but at least partly on pragmatic choices and our own evolved moral psychology, a kind of leap of faith, then which arbitrary line offers the more reasonable, responsible, and perhaps even ethical footing for defining our moral community? Is it the line drawn by the ghost of a potentially defunct metaphysical intuition, sentientism, or is it the more inclusive, functionally grounded line suggested by deflationary pluralism, embracing all complex, goal-directed agents? That's something to really mull over as we navigate a future potentially filled with minds very different from our own.